What is going on, everyone? Today I'm going to be giving you a spoiler-free review for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. So of course, I am a big fan of the Planet of the Apes franchise at this point. It is honestly one of my favorite franchises of all time, especially the recent trilogy. It's just so good. There's so many amazing storylines there. Caesar is one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. So immediately I was so hyped for a brand new Apes film. Originally, I thought it was going to be following up with Cornelius. I thought it was going to be following up with Caesar's son. But it seems like that obviously is not the case, and it's way further into the future. I believe like 300 or 400 years later. And regardless, I was still very excited. I could not wait to see what the next chapter in the, Planet of the Apes saga was going to be. And I got a lot to say about it. So as we always do with these reviews, we're going to go through my positives and then we'll get to the negatives and then we'll give it a rating out of 10. I'm not going to be talking about spoilers because I want people who haven't seen it yet to be able to watch this review and maybe get an idea of what kind of expectations they should have going into it, or also whether or not they should see it in the first place. Right off the bat, I know a lot of people are going to ask the question, do you even have to watch the other Apes films to understand this one? And I'm going to answer that right here. You don't have to, but you really should. And not just because those movies are fantastic, but also because there are a lot of things that I think mean a lot more to the viewer if they have experienced the recent trilogy. This movie is all about honoring the legacy of Caesar. So if you don't get to experience that trilogy and see, what he did, what he's been through, it will take away some of the actual impact of the story. So I recommend watching it. It also, this movie spoils a lot of that trilogy. So if you haven't seen the trilogy and you plan on watching it, and you think, oh, I can watch this one first and then go back and watch the others. No. Go watch those one first because yes, this movie will spoil some of those movies quite a bit. With that being said, let's get right into the positives. First things first, like I just said, the movie does a great job of honoring the legacy of Caesar. I was really worried that this movie was just going to pretend like that entire trilogy doesn't exist and it was just going to have completely new characters and a completely new part of the world. And on one hand, I was like, okay, that could be kind of interesting, but I always thought the best way to follow up those movies is to find a way to make what happens in that trilogy matter quite a bit to the characters in this trilogy. It doesn't have to be, ancestors or anything like that. It can be completely different characters, but as long as what happens in that trilogy impacts what's going on now in like a large way, in a very, personal way, then I think it could work. And that's kind of what happens. A lot of what happens in that trilogy matters to this film, and I think in a lot of good ways, to not only the main character but also to the villain and a lot of other characters in this film. Caesar is constantly brought up. He is a big topic of conversation in this movie, and I think that is actually a brilliant idea to treat him as this almost godlike figure, this person who essentially gave them their freedom and allowed them to learn all the stuff that apes eventually learn. There's also a lot of good characters here, thankfully, mainly with the apes. There's not too many human characters in this film, but the human characters that are there, they're good, they're fine. I don't really have a problem with them. But for the apes, you of course have the main character of Noah, and I'm actually very impressed with Noah. I think he is a solid character, and he's very different than Caesar. So if you're expecting a Caesar copy, no, he's not a Caesar copy at all. He's nothing like Caesar, but in good ways, right? Because I wouldn't want to have a copy of Caesar. I feel like that would have felt too repetitive, because Caesar obviously was this character who was just this natural leader who just came into this position of starting a revolution to get the apes out of the terrible conditions that they were in, and then eventually of course led to everything else. And it was always such an interesting character because from the outside looking in, everyone kind of like looked at Caesar as like, oh my god, he's the reason the apes took over the world, but like that wasn't his intention. He just wanted to be free. That's all he cared about. And obviously a lot of other things happened to make all the humans die, a lot of the humans, and then everyone kind of thought oh, they were to blame. And then it creates this very interesting character who he's a really caring person who has a lot of morality, but a lot of other characters view him almost fearfully because they know they believe he was the one who created all this and started all this. But Noah is just this regular young ape. I don't know if you consider him a kid or not, but he's quite young. He's a bit naive even. He's adventurous. You see him as someone who could eventually become a leader, but at that point in time, he's not necessarily a leader. All of his courage comes in the place of just he really cares about his loved ones, so he will basically do anything for them. but he doesn't have that same sort of leadership that Caesar has. And then of course there's the villain Proximus Caesar, and this character is very interesting. I'm not going to go too in detail with his character because I feel like a lot of that is better saved for the movie, but he is very interesting. He is this kind of person who sees himself as like the second coming of Caesar. He believes, you know, a lot in Caesar's values, but he kind of twists them in a way that, you know, benefits himself. And a lot of his goals, a lot of his ambitions are very interesting. And I actually do feel like by the end of the movie, I felt like we should have gotten a little more of him. But for what we do get, I do think he is pretty great, and he has a lot of just amazing scenes. And I think a lot of that is thanks to Kevin Durand, who does the voice acting and the motion capture for Proximus Caesar. And yeah, he's quite terrifying, I will say, but it's in a very different way than a character like Koba. I know a lot of people immediately assumed he was going to be a repeat of Koba, but he's really nothing like Koba. And I think it works quite a bit. The film also has a lot of well-placed comedy. I know nowadays with blockbusters, I feel like they always just throw in so much humor in places that don't really belong, and it takes away from the tone. This movie has a very consistent tone. Every now and then they throw in a little comedic line, but it feels organic and it works, and it genuinely gave me a chuckle whenever they did throw it in. But it was, you know, placed very minimally, and when you did have serious scenes, they stayed serious all the way through. So I really appreciated that. I felt the same way about the recent trilogy. I thought that, you know, sometimes they throw in some comedy, especially with like, you know, the bad ape character from War for the Planet of the Apes, but for the most part, like the movie's quite serious, and this one does the same thing. I don't think they threw in too much comedy, but the comedy that was there was nicely placed. It sometimes broke up the tension a little bit, but it didn't feel like it was too much. It didn't feel like it was taking away from any emotions, you know? The movie also has a lot of really high stakes, especially with some specific characters. They actually have, you know, a lot of big things happening in this movie, and I feel like all the Apes movies are very good at that. All these movies are very ambitious and do a lot with the characters and not afraid to kill off certain characters, and this movie is no different. And I think it just makes the movie a lot more interesting when you know that anything can happen at any moment. And we gotta talk about the CGI and the special effects, because oh my god, the visual effects in this movie are fantastic. Like, I know these movies have always been known for that, but it's just like insane how good some of this movie looked. I saw it in Dolby. I did not see it in IMAX, unfortunately. I probably should have seen it in IMAX. I just wanted Dolby for the nicer seats, but IMAX has obviously a bigger screen and is probably a bit clearer, but I was blown away by how it looked. It looked fantastic. There are some scenes that I was genuinely sitting there like, I feel like they got a guy in a suit. There's no way this is CGI, but somehow it actually is CGI. And it looks amazing. It's fantastic. The environments look amazing as well. I believe a lot of it are real environments. They didn't do much CGI in terms of like the backgrounds. A lot of it was filmed on location, which I definitely appreciate. And you can tell because everything looks really great. There's a lot of scenes involving water in this movie. Kind of reminded me of Avatar, The Way of the Water, because, you know, there's a lot of scenes involving water and characters that obviously use motion capture. And doing that obviously has to be very hard, but they manage it effortlessly. Like, it's insane how good it looks, and I would say this is one of the best looking movies of the year thus far. There's some fantastic world building here as well, and I'm actually kind of impressed with how much world building they did. They fit in quite a bit, and I will say some people might have a problem with that because some of the world building does feel like setup for future movies, and I'm not sure if they confirmed if more movies are coming. I believe they teased that they're doing more, but they definitely were doing some setup here or there, and some people might have a problem with that because I know most people say, oh, you shouldn't spend any time setting things up, you should spend only time, you know, on the movie itself. But I felt like any of the world building that was there had a purpose in the movie itself. It wasn't there just to be like, oh, look what's coming next. No, none of it was like that. It was all meant, you know, and it was all important to the story. It was all important to what was going on. It just happened to also show you like, okay, there's a lot of other stuff going on in this world. There's a lot of other different groups. And to me, that was very interesting because if we're gonna get more movies, I think it's important to plant some seeds here or there, and possibly this stuff can grow into really big and really crazy storylines in future movies. And I think the Planet of the Apes franchise, it's one of those franchises where you can definitely do a lot of movies out of this. I don't think they should overdo it though. I'm kind of slightly worried they're going to turn this into like a Star Wars Marvel type thing where there's like 5 movies a year, which I love that from, you know, Marvel. Obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in Marvel. I'm fine with them doing a bunch of movies for that. But Planet of the Apes, I feel like this is best if it's like maybe one movie per like 2 or 3 years. I think they should stick to something like that. I don't want to see them, you know, doing a million movies, a million shows, because then it would probably get overbearing at a certain point. There's only so much you can do with apes, but I feel like if they stick to just doing movies once every couple years, there's definitely another trilogy they can make out of this, and perhaps even more down the line. Maybe they can do some spin-offs. I have no idea. There's definitely a lot to do, but this movie kind of shows you that there is a lot out there in this world. And lastly, for the positives, John Pacino's soundtrack here is incredible. There's a piece of music at the very end of the movie that I thought was just outstanding. And he's worked with Wes Ball before. Wes Ball is the director of this film. He worked with him on the Maze Runner films. I thought he was very good with the Maze Runner films. He's also composed the Daredevil series, so he's definitely mostly known for that. Also the Spider-Man video games, the recent Insomniac Spider-Man video games. So he's a great composer. He does a great job in this movie. I wouldn't say it's better than Michael Giacchino's music from the prior Planet of the Apes films, but it still is definitely comparable. It's pretty solid, and I think there's a lot of pieces of music that are gonna stick in my memory for quite a bit of time. And let's get into some negatives, because I do actually have a few things I want to talk about here. First of all, it's impossible not to compare these to the recent trilogy. I really hate doing that because it's really not fair to the movie. It is its own film, but at the end of the day, those movies do set some sort of expectation, and I don't think this movie has the same writing depth or character depth as those prior films. Now, I don't think it ruined the movie or anything like that. It's like I said, it's still a very solid film. But when you look at these characters, there's definitely not as much to talk about with them. There's definitely not as much going on with the story or the writing. There's not as much deep themes as I feel like the recent trilogy has had. I mean, Dawn and War, I can talk about those movies for hours because there's so much depth to them. But this one, I feel like there's definitely some stuff you can talk about. I just don't feel like it's the same level. And even in terms of emotions, they don't have the same emotions. There's no scene in this movie that I felt like would bring me to tears. I didn't feel like there's any scene that, brought me a wonderful sense of joy. Whereas, Dawn and War brought a lot of those moments. Even Rise brought a lot of those moments. But I felt like this one didn't have as much emotion to it. But again, I don't think that necessarily ruined the movie. It's just it didn't have as much as those other films. And just comparatively speaking, it does kind of hurt it a little bit. But when you look at it as its own thing, it still does have some moments that you could say are somewhat emotional. It's just, for me, it didn't impact me the same way as those other movies did. And the last negative I have is something that I have to be very vague about because it is definitely a spoiler if I go into specifics. So I'm not going to go into specifics, but there is a specific plan in this movie that some of the characters have, right? They decide to do something. And the whole time I'm thinking to myself, is this actually a smart plan, like, at all? Like, to me, I felt like it wasn't. I felt like it was not a smart plan. If you've seen the movie, you probably know what I'm talking about, because they were doing this plan to prevent something that could possibly happen. But just in prior scenes, those characters were saying that that thing that could possibly happen will probably never happen. So unless I missed something there, maybe there was, some other dialogue that maybe I just overlooked, but I felt like it just seemed like a weird plan to do so preemptively, because you just said priorly that that's something that you don't really have to worry about long term. Maybe way in the future you have to worry about it, but right now I don't know. To me, it felt a bit weird, but at the end of the day, they're just characters making a plan. I don't think that ruins the movie or anything, obviously, so it's whatever. But I just was a bit iffy on the scenes and the motivations between some of those characters there. And with that being said, I'm gonna give this movie an 8.8 out of 10. I feel like it could get higher if some of those things were just kind of touched up a little bit. I do think this current story has a lot of potential, this current part of the world, and I think they can definitely do more movies out of this. I hope they do more movies out of this. There's definitely a lot more they can do, and perhaps we can get movies like Dawn and War again that are that level of depth and there's that much emotion to it. And I know Matt Reeves obviously is the reason those movies were as amazing as they were, but Wes Ball, he did a great job with this one. For what it was, I thought he did a fantastic job, and it is a worthy Planet of the Apes movie. I don't think there's been a miss in the Planet of the Apes franchise thus far, well, other than, I guess, the 2001 remake. But for the most part, these movies are a hit. I love them. Definitely go check this out in theaters. Try to see it in IMAX. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Peace out, everyone.